Well, Norway is often kind of held out as the exception to the rule when it comes to the resource curse and how being a natural resource state generally goes poorly for a population. Norway is always kind of held out as the shining star of how it can be done well. There was a lot of controversy because in the North Sea, Norway has this massive extended economic zone. And so Norway gets to decide if they're going to allow deep sea mining over that area. And for the past few years, Norway has been kind of going through the process of developing regulations, kind of going through an opening process to allow deep sea mining in Norway's extended economic zone. Deep sea mining is extremely controversial. There's a lot of people pushing hard against it. There's some corporate interests and government interests pushing for it. There's a lot of people talking about, well, you know, if you don't let us mine the deep sea, if you don't let us get the cobalt out of the deep sea, then you are supporting child slavery in the Congo. That's one of the narratives that you hear. And there's a lot of these kind of narratives. There's It kind of ties into strategic mineral security. That's why the United States has now kind of thrown its hat into the ring and is supporting potential bypassing of the International Seabed Authority. And so what I'm actually doing my PhD on is the kind of how we make decisions, how we make ethical decisions in situations of trade-offs where we're trading off between value categories that kind of don't necessarily align. And so
Hey, I'm Al, and this is the Paglalayag podcast. I'm using this podcast to showcase what's going on around me in the hardware and clean tech sectors dito sa Philippines. With guests from across the startup, research, investment, and enabler ecosystems, Paglalayag focuses on the stories and inspirations that motivate us to start up in hardware and press on down this arduous path of steering our economy away from the looming climate catastrophe that makes itself increasingly felt in our lives each passing year. I hope you'll find this cast of characters as impressive and inspiring as I do. Also, if you've been listening to these podcasts and want to let me know what you think, there's a survey form available at paglalayag.net-podcast. You can also reach out by email at al@paglalayag.net. I'd love to hear from you. Sige, tuloy tuloy lang. Let's jump in. All right. So, welcome everybody to Paglalayag. I'm Al, and today I'm going to be chatting with Eric Young. Eric Young and we met at a wilderness first aid training in the mountains of Alberta probably 15 years ago, the same year that he placed as a solo ultramarathonist through the mountains of a town called Grand Cache. They called it the death race. Suffice it to say, he's one of the people who opened my eyes to the world of long distance running and barefoot. So for any listeners who like to comment on my shoes, that's a big part of Eric has been a big influence for me getting into that whole thing. That besides what I saw them do to my father's knee. But yeah, you can blame Eric for that primarily. But Eric's now a researcher at Sintef. They're a Norwegian independent research organization, and he's mainly focused on nickel extraction and the economics around it, so much so that he's doing a PhD on the ethics surrounding critical minerals extraction. It goes without saying that there's always lots of ethical dilemmas and challenges when it comes to big projects like mining. So I pulled him over to Paglalayag today to wax philosophical about battery metals and some of the dilemmas that are present in transitioning the world towards low carbon renewable energy resources and EVs. All of those require lots of metals. And step further, last year, Eric also kicked off his own podcast called The Elements of Deep Sea Mining, which features a broad range of professionals, researchers, entrepreneurs who are active in this emerging sector of actually setting up mining operations in the deep sea, way past international boundaries and stuff like that. So yeah, glad to have you with me. It's been a while. How's everything going today, Eric?
Yeah, Al, nice to see you again. It's been a while. Yeah, everything's going good. I'm happy to be on the other side of the interview microphone for a change.
And not so much running, I hear these days. I guess more occupied with the family life and that. Are you
Yeah,
doing
I
any
don't understand.
running like that at all anymore? Or?
No, I haven't quite figured out how people manage to do, yeah, ultra distance running and have a family at the same time. Just like the amount of time that it takes to run long distances seems to me incompatible with the amount of time it takes me anyway to just make lunches and clean the house and get the kids to bed. So
Yeah,
that's on
give it.
pause.
They're pretty young still. Give it a few years. But I think, I mean, yeah, it is a pretty big commitment. I think you finished in like what, 20 hours or something? 120 kilometers. That was a pretty massive race that you're doing there.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which race, but the death race, I think my fastest time was about 17 hours over 125K. Um, yeah, back in my youth.
Yeah, I guess it's getting up there in years a bit now, but yeah, I don't know. You've always been quite inspirational for me in your ability to do that kind of stuff. And in a lot of ways we've kind of like had a kind of semi-parallel track, like kind of going through in Canada, but then making our way into this like international emerging clean tech scene. So yeah, I always find it interesting talking to you and hearing what you're up to these days. So why don't we start by just if you want to get into how did you decide that this is what you wanted to pursue with your research, the nickel as a theme.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I did my master's on the global nickel supply chain. I started that about 5 years ago. And the question that we started with for that was just kind of the question of like at the time, I think nickel was only about 5% of nickel was going into battery applications. Electric vehicle use was pretty minimal. And there was the question of, if electric vehicles are going to overtake internal combustion engine vehicles, and we're going to really need to ramp up the amount of nickel produced in order to make lithium ion batteries, is there going to be some kind of a bottleneck in the nickel supply chain? Is there going to be, because battery grade nickel isn't exactly the same as the nickel that goes into stainless steel. And so, was there going to be just kind of from an infrastructure or some other hinge point in the supply chain going to be a problem that kind of wasn't foreseen in the nickel, yeah, kind of in the nickel growth picture? And that was right around when things were blowing up I mean, the electric vehicle space was blowing up and the nickel mining really shifted. So it was during my master's that Indonesia announced that they would start to take what was kind of nickel pig iron, like the lowest grade nickel production, kind of only suitable for stainless steel, and said, you know what, we can actually take this and we can convert it into nickel sulfate, so battery grade nickel to go into the electric vehicle stream. So it was kind of like we were in the middle of doing a research project and we had identified this problem, this bottleneck, and then basically the producers in Indonesia solved that bottleneck in front of our eyes and said, you know what, that's not going to be a problem. We're going to ramp up even the kind of nickel production that at that point had never gone into the electric vehicle stream. And I mean, obviously, since then, the nickel space, especially with batteries and the minerals going into batteries, there's a lot more variables. Back then, it was a little bit kind of straightforward. There's a few battery chemistries at play, and now there's just so many different chemistries, different aspects, different kind of front runners for what's going to be the new battery tech that is actually become quite hard to follow. I've lost currency with what's going on in that space.
Are you talking cathode material? Or are you talking about like alternatives to nickel sulfate?
Well, nickel sulfate is a cathode. Like nickel gets used in lithium ion battery cathodes, and in order for it to kind of get, in order for it to get made into the right structure that you need in order for the cathode to like be able to transfer electrons or ions kind of in and out. You need that nickel to be in a very pure and ready form, and nickel sulfate is one of the kind of like most common precursors to making nickel rich cathodes.
Right, because then they'll because what I'm where I was getting at there is like it'll then be mixed with like cobalt and manganese in the most common types of batteries for EVs, especially as like the cathode material. I guess I don't know what the charge because they're not. I always read about the mineral structures, but I don't know exactly what the chemical formula is. But
Yeah,
like,
but that's exactly right.
are you saying?
The
So you're saying it's that is a nickel sulfate that is actually in the final mixture that also includes the manganese and cobalt.
this nickel sulfate is the precursor to the cathode material. So
Right.
when
Yeah.
you're
That's what I
yeah,
was.
so you get the nickel comes out of the ground as an ore, and then depending on the process route, it gets smelted to be a nickel matte, or it gets smelted to be a ferronickel, or it gets leached to be some kind of a precipitate intermediate material. But at some point, generally, before it gets kind of put into being a cathode, it has to be made into a nickel sulfate material. And so that was what back in my day, a few years ago, we kind of considered to be battery grade nickel was high purity nickel sulfate, and that was like ready to then get mixed with the cobalt and the manganese into the cathode.
Yeah, I know that when they're talking about high purity manganese, it's also a sulfate. I'm not sure about cobalt, but I imagine they want them all to be in that kind of two positive ionic state, perhaps, and then the purity is perhaps easier to control when you're not because ferronickel, then you have iron in it, so you're not dealing with a single ionic positive ion, I guess.
Yeah, and
I
I mean the chemistry is a little bit beyond me. I was always kind of the simplistic chemistry mindset that well, you when you're talking about trying to deal with these minerals for the supply chains, it was like well either you're melting them down, you're smelting them, or you're dissolving them in some kind of an acid, often a sulfuric acid, and then at some point you want to purify that while it's still in the leached state, and the nickel and the sulfur together is some kind of a nickel sulfate um, that is easy to be put into a solution that can then be whatever they do to make that whatever they do to make it into the kind of final cathode step. I assume it kind of comes from its leached liquid stage. Um, yeah, but yeah, I'm not. And to
Yeah,
be
you
honest,
were you were not you weren't getting into metallurgy of it itself. You were just more focusing on the supply chains and where the tonnages are coming from and going to, I think, right?
absolutely, and I think it's. I mean, I tried to get into the metallurgy as much as I could, given that I was kind of coming at it from a standing start, because I think that that's really important with doing that kind of analysis. Like a lot of people think that, oh, well, it's not so important to understand the chemistry. We want to just look at the economics and the supply chains. But obviously, if you can know the chemistry and know what's possible and what's potentially going to change, that was a big kind of chemistry question. And that's what we encountered when they kind of opened the valve and said, we're going to take what had been just considered to be absolutely not battery grade and make it into battery grade
Because
without
they had
problem.
such huge tonnage of it.
Yeah,
The story in Indonesia, I agree. That's changed the dynamics a lot for the way people are talking about battery metals these days.
yeah.
Um,
I mean, and especially just the way that the way that Indonesia overtook the nickel market and forced a lot of other players out. That was another big dynamic of the system that when I was studying it, I was kind of I would talk to experts and say, like, what's going to happen if this aspect of the market changes? What's going to happen if they bring online a whole bunch of cheap nickel from somewhere. And everyone told me, the few people that I interviewed told me, these mining companies, they've got so much economic inertia that you can't just shut them down by bringing on cheaper supply somewhere. They're going to ride out the lows and keep producing. And then that happened. Indonesia brought on just tons of new cheap supply, and a bunch of producers shut down. Kind of exactly what I was told wasn't going to happen. So that was quite interesting and humbling. You do your research and you ask the smartest people out there what's going to happen, and then something just completely different happens.
These are producers like mainly in Europe or North America
Well,
or
I
what?
think I mean Australia. The name isn't coming to me, but Australia had some major nickel producers that had been running for a very long time, basically closed their doors because they couldn't compete with the quantity and price coming out of Indonesia in the last couple of years.
Right. Yeah, I guess it at that point when like this new solution comes along, you're now sort of grappling with how long can they sustain it for? Like how long is the low going to be? Like I mean, metal prices can be up and down, but if it's literally just this new supply coming online and it's got a runway to it, then that's a very different calculation.
Yeah, right. Better to at that point you're kind of like, well, are we cutting our losses now, or are we gonna hold on and kind of drive this right into the mountainside? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because that's the supply side. Supply tends to change more slowly. Demand can be all over the place. They got that what Michael Burry talked about it not that long ago. The bullwhip effect, where like the the supply chain really can get or whipsaw. I've also heard it called the bull. I think the bullwhip is like it. The changes at the demand side become increasingly fast and erratic as you go further away from the source, and that's why mining as a like the commodities are so volatile. It's just that the it's just like really chaotic like sort of interplay of supply and demand in each of these different steps getting close, like getting further away from the end user, closer to the mine.
That's a nice image, actually, and that was the kind of study that I was trying to do. Was I was trying to do a systems analysis of the entire nickel supply chain and show how the different aspects are connected. So if there's a change in a certain type of demand, that's not only going to affect those types of suppliers who are specialized in that kind of type of feedstock, but it's going to have repercussions throughout the system because everything is kind of connected to everything else in different ways. So I like that bullwhip analogy.
Yeah, there's a game. I'll send you a link after. I'll include in the show notes as well, called the Beer Game. And it's just like a little economic model number set of numbers. I mean, they got some visualizations around it as well, but you've got like the farm like 4 or 5 steps along before you're selling like kegs of beer to the bar or whatever. And then so the demand changes and you have to try to plan how much you're going to produce, and you can play as each of those steps and you can just see how it's just all over the place if you're like far away from the end user, even if the end
Right.
user changes in patterns and consumption is not changing that much.
Yeah, and with the nickel space, as they say, I mean, there's always just the question of whether nickel is going to continue to be the kind of whether what is it whether it's
The
going to be one
go-to
of the
mineral for
main
batteries.
ingredients in battery cathodes. And so like at one point, nickel was edging out cobalt. Everyone was trying to get rid of cobalt in their battery cathodes, and so it was kind of big breakthroughs when the heavy nickel and low cobalt batteries came out, and that really kind of obviously increased the expectations for what the nickel demand was going to be going into the electric vehicle sector. And then and then as kind of the LFP chemistries started to show themselves as being able to meet the demand even in the electric vehicle market, then there's a ton of kind of questions about, oh, is nickel even going to see the growth that we were predicting back then? And I mean, just for context, I mean, in 2019, nickel was or batteries were 5% of the nickel market. The stainless steel industry was 60% of kind of what nickel was going into. And that was predicted to become about 50-50, that battery nickel was going to grow to be the same size as nickel for stainless steel
Yeah, we
by
both interviewed Lyle. I think on his, he mentioned 20% batteries on our, and he said it's not unreasonable by his numbers to think it might reverse and actually be 80% batteries in, I don't remember what kind of timeline he was talking about, but like you just never
yeah.
know. Like estimates, nobody can do estimates very well, but yeah, the story can change a lot. Please, sorry to interrupt.
No, yeah, that was just exactly it. And so I think that question of the supply side being kind of whipped around by just even kind of expectations or for the demand side is really big in nickel because because there was just like there's anticipated a ton of growth in electric vehicles, but there's still a kind of every month a new announcement of new battery technology that might be the kind of big game changer.
Right, right. So getting into a little bit more just like about Norway itself, they've like with their sovereign wealth fund, they're often talked about as like a shining example of like managing natural resource wealth really well. Like now that you've lived there, because like we both met in Alberta, Alberta tried to do that back in the '80s, but ultimately they didn't have the political discipline to kind of keep going with it. Like having lived there, would you say that it's all that it's cracked up to be by some of these international commentators?
Yeah, no, and that's that. I mean, that's something that the comparison between Norway and Alberta in terms of what they've done with their oil money is something that just you can't help but bother you in my situation because I'm living here in Norway, seeing all of the prosperity that comes from having that security, comes from having done something responsible with their resource money, and then yeah, having read about the comparison to the Alberta situation where they tried to do the same thing and just couldn't. And I saw a statistic not too long ago. I'm going to get it wrong, but it was something like, for every dollar of revenue that comes out of that's produced by the oil sector, Norway's like captures like 70 cents, 70% of that money gets captured into kind of the public good, into public coffers one way or another. And in Alberta, it's something like 10 or 15%. Like it's just massive the difference in how much of that resource wealth, which is, I mean, natural resources are inherently owned by the, well, it's common to take that natural resources are owned by the people of the country. And so just to like put it side by side and see that in the Norwegian case, 70 cents on the dollar goes back to the people. And in the Albertan case, it's 15 cents on the dollar. And where does the rest of that go? It just goes to the companies. And one of the big reasons, this is one of my hobby horses, one of the big reasons why Alberta or why Norway had such success as compared to Alberta is because Norway, not only did they kind of have like strict rules and like government discipline, but they also had a national oil company that they forced into all of the deals that they were doing with international oil companies. So they said, yeah, you guys can come over and you can exploit our oil, but you've got to do it hand in hand with us. And our company, Statoil, now Equinor, is going to be there riding along with you. And then that just gave Norway a huge, like a massive bargaining chip in future negotiations where now when they want to open a new oil field, the international companies say, well, we'll give you kind of these terms, and Norway can say, no, we don't want those terms. We'll give you these terms. And if the oil company says, no, like not good enough, we're out of here, Norway will say, well, no problem. We've got our own oil company. You guys can play with us or go home. Whereas in Canada, I mean, the big oil companies are all American owned. We can't tell them to go home because we don't have the Canadian kind of muscle to take over. And so just like from a strategic bargaining perspective, just having a well functioning national oil company, I think, was one of the things that set Norway kind of in such a superior position. But yeah, I mean, living here, you see the just the benefit of that uh, public resource money just everywhere. There's tons of services, there's tons of infrastructure. The infrastructure here is insane. Bridges and ferries that go to these tiny little remote communities that you just know this is costing a ton of money. And in Canada, there would never be infrastructure to these places, but Norway can afford it because they uh, took their resource money and put it into, yeah, public goods.
And it's because it's not just that they get a lot of royalties from the oil. They've also been very disciplined about only spending the royalties and not like only spending the dividends off of their investment funds rather than spending the royalties. That I think that was the thing that that Alberta tried to do, but was not able to maintain that, or the later governments kind of took it apart.
Yeah, it's tough to. I mean, it's tough to hold a government to that when they have the right to break that rule. But during what was it during COVID when the price of oil went through the floor, Alberta was suddenly in trouble with their
Yeah,
budget because they were intending to spend that year's oil money that year, whereas Norway had no problems because they were spending 2% of the oil money that they'd accumulated, or like, yeah, they've got a max where they can spend 2% of their total fund in any given year, and generally they just spend a proportion of the interest. So yeah, so when the oil price went through the floor, Norway didn't have any problems. They were still budgeting off of previous year's investments, which was just like yeah, a night and day kind of display of how good planning say
yeah.
yeah
The
avoid
the
problems.
kind of financial planning that's like really boring to listen to, but very rewarding if you can follow through on it. And
Yeah.
well, kind of one of the reasons I was getting into that is because they also were a very solid leader in like early EV adoption, and because they've been able to get themselves into that situation, they've been able to like export a lot of their hydro resources and things like that, or like export a lot of their fossil fuels, and then they had such hydro resources that they could then use that for the electric vehicles, and it created quite an interesting situation. Um, so like with that whole thing in mind, the way that they've been transitioning their own sort of energy economy, how would you describe Norway's interest in like nickel and the deep sea mining trends that are coming?
Yeah, so Norway has been in the news a lot. I mean, it's tough to say because I'm in Norway, so this is a very big story here. But for the last 2 years, there was a lot of controversy because Norway has a very large extended economic zone. So normally, a country is allowed, kind of given ownership, 200 nautical miles off of their coast. That's like the portion of the ocean that is a country's economic zone.
Territorial
But
waters, basically.
yeah, and that's where you're allowed kind of dominion over resource extraction there. But in Norway's case, you can you can kind of apply to have this extended if you have like a continental shelf, if you've got underwater structures that kind of justify that you should have a bigger area. And so because Norway has this big continental shelf that reaches out to a couple of kind of small volcanic islands out in the North Sea, Norway has this massive extended economic zone. And so Norway gets to decide if they're going to allow deep sea mining over that area. And for the past few years, Norway has been kind of going through the process of developing regulations and kind of going through an opening process to allow deep sea mining in Norway's extended economic zone. And this has been extremely controversial, both in Norway and certainly in Europe, when Norway made announcements that they were going to open for deep sea mining. And there's a lot of controversy over what opening for deep sea mining means in this context. It was kind of worded as if Norway was going to open to allow deep sea mineral extraction, exploitation, but they kind of had actually only said that they would open for deep sea mineral exploration, which is a big difference, but it's a little bit semantic, and the semantics were poorly handled, and so there was a lot of pushback. And yeah, to kind of get back to your question about like how does this tie into Norway's history as a resource nation? I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, Norway traditionally has very high trust in government. So Norway has been exploiting its resources for a long time. There's hydropower built all over the country. That's why there was such fast EV penetration here, because there's tons of cheap hydroelectricity. Or Norway obviously has been very successful exploiting its oil resources, and so the population has kind of like made its peace with getting its wealth off of the back of exploiting the natural resources and kind of trusting the government to manage that well. Norway is often kind of held out as the exception to the rule when it comes to the resource curse, and how being a natural resource state generally goes poorly for a population. Norway is always kind of held out as the shining star of how it can be done well. But then when they tried to do it with deep sea mining, there was a lot of pushback, to the point that they had to reverse their opening process because one of the political parties made a stand and said that they wouldn't support it in the most recent budget negotiations. So even though there had been kind of an opening for exploration that was approved by Parliament and ratified by the King and everything, the next year's budget negotiations, they had to go back on that because one of the more left-leaning political parties, kind of buoyed up by all of the public resistance, managed to throw a stick in the wheel.
But if I'm gonna like do a little bit of geologist speculation, if you're talking about something on the continental shelf in Norway, that sounds quite different to the sorts of deposits that you would be finding in the open ocean, where a lot of the big payloads that people are pointing at, like the Clarion-Clipperton Zone and like off the Marianas Trench, like
Yeah.
that quite like I don't think there's any active volcanoes or recently active volcanoes around there, are there?
So yeah, so when it comes to deep sea mining, there's a couple of different resource types, and the most kind of well-known ones of the most interest right now are the ones on these abyssal plains, and famously kind of in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the Pacific.
Yeah, which is kind
Uh,
of between Hawaii and California, for like, more or less, kind of a east-west zone stretching between them, but pretty far.
yeah, and Norway doesn't have that kind of abyssal plain in its economic zone, but Norway has the second largest, um, the second most, whatever, square kilometers of seafloor spreading ridges within its economic zone,
Okay.
second after Fiji. And the seafloor spreading ridges are where you get these active hydrothermal vents. And one of the other potential mineral resource kind of types when it comes to deep sea mining is inactive hydrothermal vent fields. So where there has been an active hydrothermal vent a long time ago and created a large deposition of minerals, and then the seafloor spreading ridges has kind of pushed that deposition farther away from the active site, and now it's inactive, and there's a bunch of minerals just kind of sitting there, still pretty close to the surface on the ocean floor, but much different than the kind of deep sea mining that has made most of the news headlines with the little potato mineral nodules that everyone just wants to go down and pick up. These ones are,
Yeah, that's like that kind of iconic pictures of just these fields, so to speak, of just these sort of rounded off rocks or potatoes, as you call them, like that are just like pretty much straight metal. They're not
yeah,
mixed up with rock so much. They're
yeah, and so the Norwegian situation with these, they're called seafloor massive sulfides. Um, it's much closer to traditional mining, and in fact, a lot of like traditional mining on land is essentially this type of seafloor massive sulfide deposit that got pushed up. And so, what we're talking about in Norway is, yeah, a much more kind of three-dimensional deposit as opposed to most deep sea or the other type of deep sea mining, which is two-dimensional.
yeah, relatively in its original form, not all twisted and folded up in mountains.
Yeah, and I talked to a geologist about this, and he said that generally when they're kind of fresher deposits on the ocean floor, they might be higher in the minerals that we care about. That as the geologic processes happen over millions of years, that would get one of these from the bottom of the floor into a terrestrial mountain. That that's going to sometimes rob the deposit of some of its whatever
Yeah,
purity
sort
or
of
minerals.
smush it up instead of keeping it in its original sort of crystalline form.
I guess so.
Could be. I mean, I'm just guessing. I haven't done any real reading into the deposits themselves, but yeah. Shifting gears, they call it the International Seabed Authority is sort of the main avenue for the international dialogue and rule development around this, I guess, right?
For the international case, so like Norway is its own jurisdiction where we're talking about it's the Norwegian government that kind of makes all of the decisions about how deep sea
For their
mining either
shelf.
happens or doesn't happen here. And then once you go outside of these extended economic zones of these economic zones into it's called the area, it's the international seabed that is kind of the area beyond national jurisdiction. I think that's what it is. Then there's a UN chartered agency called the International Seabed Authority that has for decades now been working on regulating, managing these resources that are kind of much more difficult because they don't belong to any one jurisdiction.
Right. And I think like much more often in the news, you'd hear about like underwater power, communication cables, and stuff like that. Sometimes we hear that stray anchors come in and slice them. But I guess all of that, as far as like the power cables and communication cables crisscrossing the straits around Europe, that would all be within like coastal waters. Is that right? Or is there or do you get international waters in that area between Norway and Germany kind of
Yeah, no, I mean there's cables crossing international waters, but that's not regulated. So even though it's called the International Seabed Authority, apparently there's a different international authority that would manage international cables. But I don't know actually anything about that. The International Seabed Authority is like very strictly focused on
resources
seabed
on this?
minerals. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was asking because I even mentioned this to you earlier. Australia and Singapore have recently done some government approvals around running like a 1.75 gigawatt submarine cable to send power from the north coast of Australia's planned solar farms up to Singapore, which is a pretty substantial cable, and and yeah, I was just I thought that sounded just because of the whole clean transition and then this stuff crossing international waters might be related. But I guess you're saying that at least as far as regulation goes, the seabed authority wouldn't have any hand in that kind of a project.
No, the Seabed Authority doesn't have any hand in cable. Apparently, the other way around, though, the cable, I don't know if it would be the international organization around cables or maybe the private interests that kind of own these cables in various locations. They show up at the International Seabed Authority meetings and say, hey, we've got an interest here also. You guys can't send all this mining equipment down there and start kind of dredging these huge areas of the Pacific because we've got cables there. You've got to be aware and you've got to kind of mind our interests also. So they're one of the groups that the International Seabed Authority, manages the interests between, in addition to, fishing interests and international shipping interests, although those are probably a bit kind of less likely to be impacted. And yeah, and then all of the other interveners that have an interest or an opinion on what the International Seabed Authority decides.
Right, right. And as I understand it, there's like a few dozen permits that have been granted to different companies so far. Does that sound about right?
There's a few dozen. I was actually just looking at this earlier. There are exploration licenses that have been granted by the International Seabed Authority to different, and it has to be. Oh, I'm going to get this wrong. I should know this better, but in order to hold a license, you need to be associated with a state. And so it's not the case that a mining company could apply to the International Seabed Authority and get an exploration license. You have to partner with a government and they apply for an exploration permit on your behalf. But yeah, I think there's something like 31 of these so-called contracts for exploration.
Yeah, exploration, but not yet extraction or exploitation.
No, there's been no actual approved contracts for exploitation, either in the international context or in any domestic context. There's a few countries that have regulations in place for how you would go to exploitation. I guess I shouldn't say that because there was exploitation happening off Papua New Guinea in the Solwara project back in 2011 or something. So in that
That was
case,
Nautilus.
yeah, that's right, yeah. So that was a case where a domestic government kind of gave not only exploration but also exploitation licenses, and there was, real deep sea mining that happened, and then that very quickly that company went bankrupt and shut down. So as far as I know, since then there's been no exploitation and there's no exploitation licenses granted. But there's a lot of jurisdictions that are moving closer. Norway has been inching closer, kind of had a recent reversal. The Cook Islands, I think, have got their regulations kind of finalized and in place, and so it's possible that we'll see applications for licenses there. And then the United States has got exploitation regulations on the books, both internationally as well as domestically. And so this year, the kind of big deep sea mining news is that one company that had previously been applying to the International Seabed Authority for permits has shifted and applied directly to the United States government for permits in those same areas. And a different company has applied to the United States government for, I think, exploration permitting to potentially mine off of American Samoa. I'm not sure what that. I'm not. I've lost the question now. I don't know if that answered it.
Well, I understand that the United States is not like a sitting member of the ISA. Is that still the case? Like I don't know how up to some of the news articles I read didn't look like they were that up to date. But
Oh no, yeah, the United States is definitely not a member of the ISA. The ISA was created back in the kind of, I think, the Reagan era, and at that point, the United States was kind of, it was helping to develop the International Seabed Authority. It was helping to set this up, and then from what I have been told, it kind of essentially pulled out, or just didn't ratify when it came time to, because the the Reagan government said, you know what, this isn't in our interest. We are the dominant international maritime power, so we're not going to tie ourselves to some kind of a global limitation when we are kind of the people who enforce all of the global maritime rules. And so the United States has always kept.
I've definitely there's definitely like a pretty strong. I mean, it goes up and down in uh, how vocal it is, but like a pretty substantial group of people who are not fans of the United Nations in the United States, and so I think
Yeah,
that kind of part of the dynamic.
yeah, and I think, I mean, and just the serious people who have always kept an eye on the need for strategic minerals have always, I think, in the United States context, just said, well, we're not going to tie our hands any more than we need to. So they've been an observer at the International Seabed Authority meetings, but they're not a member.
And what one of the like, I mean, the company that has got the most permits or contracts or whatever you call them with the ISA at this time is China, as I understand it. I ended up having a look at one of them in the Marianas Trench area, being the closest area of the Philippines. It ends up being like maybe 2,000 kilometers due east of the Philippines. These tenements are like a degree latitude by a degree longitude. This is pretty big areas, and there's like a couple of these like shelves sitting on the seabed floor with what they're calling cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts. So I guess perhaps these like these deposits that spread out, and then maybe there was some sort of erosion, and this is what's left over. The way you see kind of like tabletop mountains
And
in different parts on land.
you know what it is with the cobalt manganese crust is that, so I mean, there's minerals in the ocean water, and then they precipitate out in different contexts. So with the nodules, there's so little sedimentation in these big abyssal plains that the minerals precipitate kind of onto these little rocks over millions of years, both from just the above surface seawater and actually from the below surface water. And then with the active hydrothermal vent areas, there's this hot water
Mineral
coming
rich.
out of these crusts, and it's very mineral rich. And then the temperature suddenly drops when it hits the seawater, and that precipitates minerals out rapidly. And what happens with the cobalt crust is you get these steep undersea mountainsides that, because of their angle, they also just don't hold sediment. And so what you get is these buildup of minerals that just precipitate out of the water, and they kind of plate themselves onto the surface of these mountains, because even though it's an extremely slow process, there's no sedimentation, there's nothing to interrupt it. And so what the cobalt crust mining is, you can get these kind of thick plates or crusts on the sides of these mountains that are, I don't know, they're between 5 and 20 or more centimeters thick, and it would be a matter of kind of scraping that crust off to get the minerals.
Did you say several meters thick?
No, no, centimeters. No, they're
Oh, wow,
thin.
just centimeters.
Again,
Wow.
it's kind of a two-dimensional deposit with
Yeah.
those.
Wow. Wow. That's you need to cover. No wonder they're so big. Yeah. Okay. Ugh. Um. Yeah. But obviously cobalt is a pretty like it's a pretty important metal. We talked earlier about the battery aspect of it and its value in that. And then right now, if you're getting it on land, you're getting it out of the Congo, which has got all sorts of human rights and sort of labor issues associated with it. Like I mean, if you're like the two minerals of concern are being cobalt and tungsten. Tungsten's not so much a battery metal, but that's the one that's like more associated with like funding warlords and stuff. But apparently the war in the Congo is like happening in a different area, not where the cobalt is, and so actually it's just child slave labor instead of like actually active war zone funding. But it's still like very uh, pretty intense situations going on there from a human perspective, and it's like the by far the dominant place where it comes from on land. So yeah,
Yeah,
I think
and
this is
that
what you really cover a lot in your podcast, right? Like the fact that the there's a lot of environmental issues, but it's a very different set of issues compared to the way the mining happens on land for this stuff.
yeah, well, these issues, especially the newsworthy kind of the recent headline aspects of cobalt in the Congo, has a big role to play in the deep sea mining conversation. So what I'm actually doing my PhD on is the kind of how we make decisions, how we make ethical decisions in situations of trade-offs where we're trading off between value categories that kind of don't necessarily align. And so in the deep sea mining debate, there's a lot of people talking about, well, you know, if you don't let us mine the deep sea, if you don't let us get the cobalt out of the deep sea, then you are supporting child slavery in the Congo. That's one of the narratives that you hear. And there's a lot of these kind of narratives. Deep sea mining is extremely controversial. There's a lot of people pushing hard against it. There's some corporate interests and government interests pushing for it. There's it kind of ties into strategic mineral security. That's why the United States has now kind of thrown its hat into the ring and is supporting potential bypassing of the International Seabed Authority to get access to these minerals because the United States is worried that China or Russia could turn off the tap on some of the minerals that they depend on, not only for new energy technologies, but also critically for a lot of military applications. And
Well,
so,
it does that kind of regularly. That's not like a far off like paranoia. Like it happens every however many years.
right,
Like it
it's not a huge hypothetical that China might use its critical mineral dominance for strategic ends.
yeah.
Um, but so yeah, so these narratives around uh, conflict minerals, child labor, biodiversity loss, especially in nickel mining in Indonesia, social impacts associated. I mean, there's been news stories recently of tailings dams collapses in Indonesia and fatalities associated with that.
What
And the
collapses? Sorry,
tailings dams collapses, there's been a
on
few,
surface.
yeah.
Okay.
And so all of that gets kind of fed into the deep sea mining debate continually. And it's a very kind of like interesting space to follow just in terms of narratives because people are always making a lot. I mean, like obviously you're making economic arguments for why someone should invest in your deep sea mining company, but in order to get approval to mine, in order to get the kind of security that you're going to get these licenses, there's a huge kind of ethical debate that's going on, and so there's this narrative warfare that's happening in the deep sea mining space, kind of over trying to say that deep sea mining is either like a much better alternative to the way that we're getting minerals right now, or it's completely irresponsible. And this is what I'm kind of studying, and this is what
So
I'm finding
yeah,
interesting is the
that's
variety of narratives that are being pulled in and how they're being used to kind of support or oppose deep sea mining.
yeah. Well, and I mean, because like under like I mean, you talk about like human experiences with mining in the past. Obviously, there's a lot of bad aspects, and like the good aspects of mining are just something that you just enjoy without having to think about. The bad aspects end up being very big, high profile things. And I often do like with the podcast, I always do quotes, and I was trying to find quotes about mining, and I couldn't really like trying to find philosophers or whatever. I mean, partly I think now the internet is getting flooded with AI websites that just like put fake stuff up that's like not quotes, but
Uh-huh.
I was still finding it surprisingly hard to find any like notable quotes about mining and philosophers and stuff. Poems for sure, like Robert W. Service, Mark Twain, putting it in literature, and they're always talking about how it drives people insane and like it's like this real toil. It's definitely that realm of like Mark Twain has that famous line. I know one of your guests mentioned it. A gold mine is a hole in the ground with a liar on top. Um, and then when I went reading about it, he actually spent time prospecting and mining for gold in Nevada. Like he was actually somebody who was like going and trying to make his bag for a time of his life.
Oh, that's amazing. I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true of Robert W. Service as well. These poets that kind of have these commentaries about how it's so kind of like corrupting of people, but like yeah, so that whole dynamic, and then the fact that like we're now in international waters. I mean, mining has often been a frontier activity where you're kind of out in lawless areas anyway. It's got that history to it, but like this is like a legal. It's not really a physical frontier, but it's a legal frontier and it's a technical frontier because going that deep into the ocean is like just extremely difficult to do from a technical basis. And so you're going to have like for one you need like a lot of resources and a lot of planning and good technology to do it. For two, you've got very little understanding of what's down there. And then for three, like you're talking about land tailings dams and stuff, like people like are like just like bringing their preconceived or like their own experiences of what's happened on the surface and applying it to this zone that is like just a different world. um
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting intersection, I think, from that perspective. And
No, you're absolutely right that it's a technological frontier, and that's why we're in this conversation right now. Like we've had deep sea mining like tests, and we've sort of had the technology. Like they ran mining tests back in the 70s or 80s, and so there's been technology that could sort of do it even 50 years ago. But now we're kind of getting to the point where they've got the technology to go that deep. We've got the capacity to make this a real industry, and so it suddenly is kind of like the new frontier. Whereas before it was always been just a little bit out of reach technologically, and I think that that's absolutely one of the aspects of it. And it's interesting that you say that that is kind of the dynamic of land-based mining, that it's always been I mean, because it's always been driven by people who have this kind of lust for adventure and willingness to kind of go to extremes outside of civilization in order to make it. And as I'm doing my podcast and interviewing the people involved in deep sea mining, that's one of the themes that I'm also kind of noticing is that it's the space is populated by people who have like a background in the mountains, in exploration, in adventure. It's like also drawing people who like are looking for the next the next frontier for sure.
yeah, some kind of mighty challenge or thing to be the first to conquest or something. Okay, we covered the cobalt and stuff. But I did notice on a map, and I'm not sure where this map came from. It didn't really show a source, but I saw one map that showed like very broadly these mineralized regions in the sea, and the part about the cobalt-rich crusts, they had a zone that extended over to kind of like the eastern shore of Mindanao, which is the southernmost major island of the Philippines. Do you have you do you know if the Philippines is like active in this space at all? Like, have they been around? Like, I don't know how closely you're following the proceedings and stuff.
I mean, I've never actually come across the Philippines in deep sea mining news headlines, to be honest with you. Recently, New Caledonia announced that they have put in a moratorium on deep sea mining, but I guess that is the closest geographically that kind of is making headlines. The Cook Islands are, some of those Pacific Island nations in that part of the world are very active in it, but I don't know if the Philippines has got any deep sea resources of that type.
Sure. Do you like that's a good point. That's something I was gonna get to. Like where the other side of the equation is that there's some pretty substantial lobby groups that are talking about a total moratorium. How do you see that kind of side of the table coming together? Like it kind of feels like some of this stuff is gonna come to a head in one way or another in the next few years, like next 2 or 3 years. It's gonna go one way or the other, or maybe somehow be a mix. But yeah, I don't know. What's your thinking about how that's shaken out?
I mean, that's tough to say. It certainly feels like we're coming to a some kind of a head right now with deep sea mining news, and especially given that the metals company has applied to the United States to essentially bypass the International Seabed Authority because, well, I guess it's a couple of things. It's like there had been expectations that the International Seabed Authority would get its exploitation regulations in place in kind of the next few years, and that has to do with details and Nauru triggering what's called the 2 year rule, where the ISA was kind of they had a rule where if somebody applied and said they would like to start that they were ready to start exploiting, then the ISA had 2 years to kind of essentially get their regulations in place. And that 2 years passed, and the ISA said, no, we're just not there. We're not going to be there. And so this has caused the metals company to go a different route and apply to the Trump administration to try to get. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say that they've applied to the Trump administration. They've applied to the United States under longstanding regulations that have been on the books since the 80s in order to apply to mine in these international waters. But yeah, at the same time, other countries are kind of finalizing their regulations. So there's a lot of activity in this space. There's a lot of interest. It feels like it's coming to a head, and that something could be happening in the next couple of years. But I guess it's impossible to say. This could just be it could be the peak, and then everybody backs off, and deep sea mining doesn't become a thing, or it could be just like a very slow process that is dragging out for decades yet.
Right. Yeah, well, Nauru is right in that Marianas Trench sort of area, so like a lot of those sort of very prospective zones sort of surrounded, aren't they? So that would, I mean, for a country that small, that far away from everything, that would really like that would be a pretty substantial game changer for them if they ended up being like just right in the middle of that whole situation.
Yeah, and I mean I think that part of so this is actually something that I don't know is why it's these small island states that are involved so heavily in the deep sea mining in international waters. Like the Cook Islands is developing mining in their own waters. PNG kind of had this experience of trying to mine in its own waters. But in international waters, you don't have to be like proximity to the location doesn't really have anything to do with it. And yet, Nauru, Tonga, Kiribati, Jamaica, these are the countries that are kind of disproportionately supporting or like kind of requesting these contracts. So, it kind of it makes sense at first pass, like, oh yeah, you're close by, you would have an interest in that. And I guess if there's going to be some kind of an industry, it's possible that it could be, whatever, could harbor out of some of these close by island states. Although when the metals company does its like test mining, it it takes off from San Diego and cruises 5 days before getting to the area. So it's not necessarily that these small island states are like the best landing location either. I think it has a lot to do with just the fact that they are small and kind of in need of economic diversification. The Cook Islands kind of famously said, yeah, we learned during COVID that being entirely dependent on international tourism isn't a very secure economic strategy because that can just get turned off for a very long time. So we want to diversify. And so I mean, and some of the NGOs that oppose deep sea mining say there's like a very exploitative relationship with these small states that these mining companies need a state backer in order to be allowed to apply in these international jurisdictions. And so then they ask Nauru or Tonga to support them because Nauru and Tonga don't have a lot of alternative options. And so they're they're easy to get on board. But this is all speculation. I don't know. This is something I'm going to look into after we're talking because I hadn't really thought about it so specifically. Like, why exactly are these Pacific Island nations overrepresented in?
Yeah, at first I was wondering if it's somehow like with FTX and the Bahamas, but Nauru is indeed like right in the middle of that Marianas Trench area. So you could imagine a nation like that having some kind of a strategy for an industry that's going to be bubbling up around it. But you're right, like those kinds of the tankers or not tankers, but like the equivalent of a tanker for ore wouldn't really need to stop, and Nauru's not going to have too much fuel or logistics kind of capacity around there in the first place.
Right.
You could probably, I mean, you could imagine a strategy forming up around it. But which country again did you say was the one that went for the moratorium?
French, New Caledonia. They
Okay.
just made a moratorium,
Well,
and
they've got a pretty big nickel on they've got big nickel production, don't they?
yeah,
If I
they've certainly got a history of the mineral industry that
Interesting.
has been, I think, quite controversial domestically. So
I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, mining's always controversial. I tried to do the Mark Twain thing and go and do the thing in Nevada for a while. And when I went to the mining shows and stuff, I kind of saw what would be involved if I really wanted to chase something like that, and I went and found a different business to be in. But definitely everything that we do involves metals and materials, and I find like it's a like with some of the very strong environmentalists I've dealt with and talked to and stuff. Like they love the electric vehicles, but then anything about mines happening is like this something that they got to fight with everything they have, and it's it's a position that's I don't know if you're going to kind of understand the bigger picture of of what's going on, then you got to reconcile that for yourself in one way or another. If you're going to try and fight global warming, then this alternative path has got its consequences also. But trying to at least be like that's why I was asking about Norway. They've set a very commendable example in terms of the way that they've managed to make it something that it has been very like has transferred a lot of benefits to society overall. I mean, you can say that about Alberta, but Alberta is in a lot of ways on borrowed time because they put so much of that royalty money into building highways and stuff, which is just not going to come back. And
Yeah,
there's I mean the stories are even worse if you get into less affluent countries, like call them the third world or whatever you want to call them. But there's obviously some very nasty legacy around mining in the Philippines and Indonesia, the tailings spills, like you mentioned, in Papua New Guinea and stuff. So,
yeah. I mean, yeah, a couple of things. So on the first of all, just on the topic of Alberta has put all their money into roads, like Alberta has put nothing into like I think using your resource money to build infrastructure is a great use of that. Like your resources is something that is kind of like a potential source of capital. And if you extract that and then you invest it into infrastructure, which is kind of a capital good that creates future wealth, then that's great. I wouldn't give Alberta a pass that they've used all their oil money on roads because again you asked me to compare with Norway. Like Norway has actually built phenomenal infrastructure using their oil money. I think that in the Alberta case they just gave too much of that money to the corporate interests and they didn't negotiate hard enough and didn't get enough of that money in order to build Alberta infrastructure. But that's kind of obviously I have a bit of a hobby horse on that topic living here. For that question of like, yeah, electric vehicles are great, but we need to mine somewhere. People love to say if it's not grown, it's mined. If you've got something, and this is another huge point of debate, especially in the deep sea mining conversation, where I would say that everyone I've come across has a pretty legitimate kind of pro social, pro environmental approach, whether they are in favor of deep sea mining or opposed to it. They're to be a deep sea mining company it's a risky venture where anyone who is in that could go and work for an offshore oil company and make better money
yeah,
more assuredly. And so I tend to believe people when they say, well, I got into deep sea mining because I wanted to do something to assist the energy transition, and this seemed like there was potential here for mining that has lower impacts than land-based mining. That's another thing that you hear a lot of is like, yeah, you want electric vehicle batteries, you don't want to cause damage in a tropical rainforest. How about doing it in an abyssal plain? And then likewise, people on the other side of the issue have like real legitimate concerns over we've just we've just recently gotten the technology to go to these places and we discovered a whole bunch of shiny minerals down there and we're going to kind of repeat the human folly of just starting off in a new place by grabbing all the shiny objects that we can see and kind of taking off. And so there's a lot of nuance I think in that conversation, and it's and to some extent I think deep sea mining is a very like quintessential crystallized case of this argument that we're kind of having all over society right now, where it's like, well, we need minerals for the energy transition, and we need resources for in order to bring the majority of humanity up to the standard of living that we in the West enjoy. We're going to need resources, and so we need to get those from somewhere, and that's going to have costs. But there's a question of trade-offs involved, and to dig into the details of those trade-offs, I think, is where we need to go in kind of the public conversation generally. And so deep sea mining is kind of one very kind of pointed case of that situational trade-offs that we're experiencing all over the place these days.
Yeah, yeah. No free lunches in economics. You wanna solve the carbon problem. Gonna have to deal with this kind of stuff. Electronics industry, solar panel industry deals with all sorts of nasty byproducts, rare earth elements in China. I mean, that's another part of it. You talk about these people with very balanced views, but you can also look at just what we've seen out of fishing from Chinese vessels off the Galapagos and stuff in international waters. And there's been a lot of criticism of the practices they've had there. I mean, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but people basically saying that they're just not paying attention. They're not even observing the national sovereignty of the countries that are close to it. And when they're on coastal waters, they'll turn off their lights to go into the coastal waters to get fish with like equipment way beyond what that country can use in the form of like high powered lights and stuff like that just bring all the fish to them in the nighttime and stuff. So you just if you try to extrapolate that to what would it mean if they ended up going after 2 centimeter crusts on the sides of these ridges, flat bench kind of mountains on the bottom of the ocean. Yeah, I mean, your speculation would probably be reasonable about it, or if you had a pessimistic guess, then you might be.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that I think Lyle also mentioned is that like mining is already happening in very remote places, kind of out of sight, out of mind, but at least it's possible to fly over to try to get some satellite images, to hike through the bush and see what's happening. But in this deep sea mining case, there would really be a next level of trust required that the the companies that are have the technology to do the mining, that they're doing what they say they're doing, that they're telling you what they're doing. And I think that's one of the big fears with this industry also is you're handing even kind of more power to anyone who gets the technology to undertake this. On the other hand, it's going to be very hard if some rogue states decides to start stripping those cobalt crusts off those mountainsides. Like, who would ever know? Like we have so little overview of what's going on in the deep ocean that
Yeah, you'd be sort of inferring from satellites and what you're seeing on the decks, I guess.
yeah.
Well, that's not such a nice thought to leave it on. What do you like? Where do you see like are you like because you've got a bit more time in your thesis? Do you see this as something that you would keep going with going forward? Like get back into the sort of adventure seeking world when the kids are a bit older, or what?
Yeah, I will try to continue to gain expertise in kind of the trade-offs of just critical minerals generally. I think that this is a topic that is becoming more relevant, more newsworthy, but also there's more activity happening in critical minerals from all aspects, and so I think that once I've done this PhD, I don't know if I'll stay with deep sea mining or broaden out to some other aspect of critical minerals, but I think there's going to be lots to research, lots to work with in the critical mineral space for a long time.
But perhaps past the stage of pulling a Mark Twain and like chasing a newspaper article or whatever the modern equivalent of that is, and going and finding yourself an autonomous submarine to go chasing potatoes in the
I don't know
Pacific.
that I'm going to be the best person to make any money in mining, but hopefully I'll be able to keep up to speed on it. And when we talk again in a couple of years, I'll have some actual insights and some actual you know wisdom to impart on the subject.
I think the stuff that you're recording in your podcast is covering some good ground already. So I'm sure it won't take you 2 years for
Thanks.
that. Cool. Well, good chatting with you, and I think we'll leave it there for anybody who's still listening. It's the Elements of Deep Sea Mining is a podcast. You got a Substack as well, I understand.
Yeah, www.elementspod.com is the website, and yeah, the Elements of Deep Sea Mining on all podcast and YouTube platforms.
Cool. All right. Well, the term for paglalag is tule lang. So keep going, and until next time, good chatting, and we'll cut her off there.
Thanks,
Peace
Al.
out.
Good talking to you.